Am I on?
Okay. Hi, I'm Noel Ortega with the Next System Project, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Toward a Caring Economy Beyond Socialism and Capitalism. We're co-hosting this webinar with the Center for Partnership Studies, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and the Laura Flanders Show. In a moment, I'll turn to Laura Flanders to introduce the webinar. But first, I want to introduce the Next System Project. For those of you who may not know us, the Next System Project is an initiative of the Democracy Collaborative that aims to think boldly about what is required to deal with the systemic, economic, political, social, and ecological challenges we're facing. Responding to hunger for a new way forward and building on innovative thinking and practical approaches being developed in communities across the country and around the world, our goal is to put the central idea of system change and that there can be a next system on the map. Working with researchers, theorists, and activists, the Next System Project seeks to promote comprehensive alternatives that are different in fundamental ways from the failed systems of the past and present, and that are capable of delivering superior social, economic, and ecological outcomes. To find out more about us and to sign our statement on the need for a debate about systemic change, please visit us at thenextsystem.org. And now I'm delighted to turn over the webinar to our friend Laura Flanders, who is a key partner on this project. She hosts the Laura Flanders Show on Link TV, Free Speech TV, and the Latin American network Telesur. On the show, where she interviews forward-thinking people and on these topics every week and profiles real existing models of making change, is also available on audio and video podcast at her own YouTube channel. You can find out more at lauraflanders.com or follow her on Twitter at GRITLaura.
All right, thank you very much, Noel. Appreciate it. Hello, everybody who is joining our webinar. We're excited to have you. And I want you to fasten your seatbelts. We are not going to have your usual conversation, certainly not the standard conversation that takes place on an important electoral primary day. All hail to those of you who are out there participating in the process. But I think what we are getting at in this conversation and in this project is a deeper need for change, a need for change that goes beyond the tinkering at the margins, the political discussions as they're currently carried in our money-driven media, and instead to some of the root causes of our challenges and some of the real possibilities that exist for change. We have extraordinary speakers joining us on this webinar, but I do want to highlight at the very start what we are going to be doing differently. And this may come as a shock to all of you, but we're going to be talking about human relations, not just economic relations. We're going to be talking about systems, not just left, right, party options, profits. We're going to be talking about relationships, and we're going to be talking about how can we develop some policies that would enable us to develop a system that would allow humans to thrive in relationship to each other and to the planet. Surprise, surprise to those of you out there who thought that maybe feminism might have a place in this conversation. We're going to talk about how our personal relationships are political, and how, in fact, male-centered and white-centered and first world-centered discussions and decision-making are primary targets for change if we are going to create the kind of alternative that we need. We will not simply magically create a society that runs differently if we keep putting the same sorts of people and the same sorts of thinking in charge. So we have some great partners for this conversation. I know they're great because many of them have been on the Laura Flanders Show. In reverse order of conversation today, we have Riane Eisler. She's director of the Caring Economy Campaign and president of the Center for Partnership Studies. And if you don't know her books, on The Chalice and the Blade and others. You should check them out. We'll be providing links. Before her will be Jim Poo. She is the director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance and co-director of the Caring Across Generations campaign. Hi, Jim. Also with us, Neva Goodwin. Neva is the co-director of the Global Development and Environment Institute at Tufts University and core support proponent. We'll hear more about core support in just a minute. And to kick things off, and to continue just a little of what Noel began, we are joined by Gar Alperovitz. He's co-chair of the Next Systems Project and much more. In many ways, the lead convener of this conversation. Gar, over to you. Why do we need a Next Systems change rather than just, I don't know, a few tweaks?
Well, thanks, Laura, and we're glad to be with all of you today. I think maybe the useful thing to do would be to start out to suggest what the Next System Project understands as an approach and kind of illustrate it, and we could then get into the different possibilities that are here. And in part, we are talking about changing the system, whatever that may mean. And in one sense, an illustration of that might focus this kind of sharply on the kind of issues we're talking about today is, how do we change the system in a way that actually nurtures different relationships, and different relationships between different genders, but also between different age groups, and between the community as a whole. And I want to stress that term, the community as a whole, as kind of the concept that would be at the center of one way of thinking about system change. And just to illustrate the systemic issue that we've been focusing on, and this is one way of approaching it. As some of you know, we've been working in cities like Cleveland, Ohio, but also in Rochester, New York, and in different areas, where the goal is to alter the pattern of wealth ownership in the community as a community, with a view to nurturing a different culture and different relationships in the community. So as opposed, for instance, to large corporations owning the wealth, and power and politics flows from that, or the state owning wealth, or even specific companies, worker companies, co-ops, where a small group of workers, and this is a positive change, own and control. How do we structure something that would nurture the larger idea that we're all in it together, and that the relationships are supported by the way the economy is organized? That's kind of a question. In the Cleveland model, as many of you know, it is a non-profit corporation aimed at the entire community, geographically, to which worker co-ops are attached, but also the notion that the community as a whole is responsible for this entity, not simply the specific worker groups that have different interests of different kinds. A similar model with more advanced preparation is now being discussed in Rochester, and again, people like Yale's one of the women leaders of the feminist geography and feminist design, a woman named Hayden at Yale, has talked about the non-sexist city, in which the design of the city becomes, Dolores Hayden, becomes a central issue of community building to nurture different cultural relationships. So at that set of questions is at the heart of a good deal of the Next System Project. How do we structure the ownership and control of wealth? As many people know, the top 400 people now have more wealth than the bottom 180 million. Worth pausing to think about that. 400 people, you could get them in a small kind of conference room, more wealth than the bottom 180 million. With that comes power relationships. That system needs to be changed, we think, but in a way that also nurtures different cultural patterns. So that's kind of a systemic design. We could go into that at different lengths and different times, lots of nuance about it, but what's a way of opening the discussion. The three different panels we have today and the presenters we have today are going to come at it in a very complementary, in my view, way, in which we're opening up different perspectives from the point of view of how income might be altered through policies of a different kind, how union structures might be altered through different organizing, and how culture directly might be structured. So if we begin to think both of system as ownership and power and wealth, and the altering that in the direction of community and new relationships, we enter the realm where culture itself becomes an integral part of the issue from the organizing side, from the system side. If we start from the other side, How do we organize programs and policies that alter the distribution of income, that alter different ways to provide support and income? How do we do that? How do we build culture directly? How do we build union power? We begin to think about a combination of structures that might move us to the next level. I think that's a way of perhaps opening some parts of this discussion.
Just by way of follow-up, Gar, talk a bit about this moment in which we find ourselves. We are, as Riane puts it, hurtling towards a seismic technical shift into a post-industrial, into a knowledge service age. What possibilities and what urgency does this moment present?
Well, I'd put two parts to that. One, the underlying technology is already extraordinary. If we divided the income already being produced in the U.S. economy by the current technology, it comes out to $200,000, $220,000 for every family of 4 today. And the new technologies open up even further space. Or to put it another way, $100,000 for every family of 4 in a 20-hour week. So we're beginning to see extraordinary possibilities now, which are only going to be multiplied as the technology moves forward, if, and this is the big if we can control the power relationships institutionally and the cultural relationships that go with it. So it poses these questions in a dramatic way. And so far, we obviously haven't done very well on that front, on either front. So it's an era where the system question, both culturally and structurally, is right before us, in no way can be avoided.
As you said, our speakers will address these themes in beautifully complementary ways. I'd like to turn next to Neva Goodwin. One of the topics that is fairly well advanced in some sectors internationally in Europe and to some extent in the United States is this conversation about a guaranteed basic income. You talk about core support. Can you clarify?
Yes. Am I properly audible? I hope. Yeah, okay. All right. So, you know, there are a variety of proposals for guaranteed basic income, but in my opinion, they all have the problem that they provide this support as a giveaway rather than a right. And core support, as I have outlined it in a paper which I hope you will find you have a link to somewhere, is an income guarantee that would be defined as compensation for household activities. It would not be presented as a handout, but rather as payment, at least partial payment, for essential services that occur in the home. These include child care, depending on the number and ages of children, health maintenance, care of sick persons in the home, food preparation and shopping, upkeep of the physical space, clothes, equipment, and vehicles, and managing household finances. Validating these activities as legitimate labor, something to be paid for, could have a significant impact in healthy redefinition of gender norms and address intra-household allocations, which is a topic normally absent from basic income guarantee proposals. In the proposal that I've written, I've made assumptions about the hours required for each of these services, depending on the size and composition of the household. And I also pay careful attention to the question of which members of a household will actually receive these funds. I'll give you a few examples. The first one is a household with just one person, who would be compensated for the core activities of food preparation, maintaining the physical space, and managing household finances. For those activities, I estimate 10 hours a week. That could be too high or too low, but as a starting point, it comes to 520 hours per year. And if we assume a wage of $15 an hour, that's $7,800 a year. So that's the minimum that would come to any household. But as I'll show, in larger households, there's no assumption that any particular individual is going to receive this particular sum. A second example is a 5-person household containing 2 able-bodied adults, plus an elderly or sick person and 2 children. The child care could easily add 40 hours a week. The needs of sick people vary widely, and for this example, I will arbitrarily add another 15 weekly hours. This total, when we've added the other items that I put with a single person, now comes to 65 hours a week. And that, when you multiply it by all the weeks in the year, I come up to an annual income of $50,700, which we can compare to the median household income in the U.S., which was $52,250 in 2013. Now, then the question is, who actually receives it? If there are several adult household members, and I will also consider teenagers as eligible to receive some portion of the core support, we're going to have to find ways of dividing it up or allocating it. In fact, I'll give you a quick rundown on that, although it is complex, and this could presumably be done in a lot of very different ways. I will divide up the amount that has been determined based on the household composition, age, health, etc., into 10 portions. And I'm assuming that every household member from age 12 up to age 84 might do some share of the work. And here's how I would share it as a starting assumption, which then can be changed by the household members by mutual agreement. So 10% of the total would be divided among any household members who are ages 12 to 14. 20 would be divided among any members ages 15 to 18. 40% to members ages 19 to 62. 20% to members ages 63 to 75, and 10% of the total divided among any household members ages 76 to 84. Now, that's very complicated, and people may not agree on the initial default assumptions of how this money is to be allocated. Do note that it does not make a point of assuming that it's the females who are doing the work. Each household would be given a sheet that describes what they are due to receive, and depending on the ages of the household members, who would receive this. They can then discuss among themselves whether they agree with this or what they might like to do differently. And then here's the particularly tricky part. There could be an arbitrator hired by the government to adjudicate this. The disadvantage of this proposal will be apparent to you already. It's very complex, and it depends a lot on government activities. There will be new jobs in the government. Census takers who annually update births, deaths, and health status. A back office component to manage and run the computer programs that would annually calculate the core support amounts due to each household. And arbitrators to adjudicate in households that either don't accept the default proposals or can't agree among themselves for an alternative.
Neva?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love you to step back just a moment and give us a sense of how, this proposal, in your view, addresses some of the points that Gar raised earlier around wealth and power and decision-making, and then secondly, humanize a little bit. How did you come to delve so deeply into this very, as you said, complex but critical proposal?
Okay, on the first question, Gar tended to stress wealth in his discussion, and this is more about income. But if this amount of income was available to every household. Obviously, different amounts available to different households depending on their needs as well as their activities. It would change everything. It would mean that people don't have to take terrible jobs because they need the income. It would be possible for most people to live on this income without paid jobs if they so chose. And of course, this assumes technology changing in such ways that we need fewer workers. And if that doesn't happen, this probably could not be implemented. As for how I came to think about this myself, it was actually a number of years before I'd ever taken an economics course, when I was the mother of young children, and I wasn't hurting financially, but I was very conscious of the fact that, first of all, it takes a great deal of time and effort, and secondly, it seems to me extraordinarily important in the world that children be well taken care of, and thirdly, it wasn't getting very much respect from anybody. And so that's where I started thinking, well, how could our society, which rewards good work by pay, reward this kind of work?
I have any idea of the sort of person who would be out there fighting for exactly this to become a reality. It is our next speaker, who is Jim Poo from the Domestic Workers Alliance. Jim, you've heard a little bit of what Neva had to say. There is more still to come, but your work and hers, it seems to me, are meeting in a certain place, and it's that place of valuing care. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing these days on this issue?
Sure. Yeah, Neva's naming of that part of our economy, which is so critical. It's the work that makes all other work possible. Naming it core, the core economy, is actually really interesting to me. I definitely think that we in the domestic workers movement think of it that way and haven't named it as such. So thanks to Neva for giving us that language. So we at the National Domestic Workers Alliance, we spend our days and nights thinking about another dimension of the same issue, which is the whole workforce that is going to work in other people's homes, carrying out the functions of the core economy, taking care of the most precious elements of our lives, our children, our aging loved ones, our homes, and and they're among the fastest growing of all workforces, because the demand for family care and domestic work is exploding in this modern era. And yet it's some of the most undervalued work, and the workforce is incredibly vulnerable. And so our work is focused on organizing the workforce, building the power, the voice, and the visibility of the women, mostly women of color, who do this work in our homes and make everything else possible in the economy through this work. So it is absolutely, we're sort of the workforce that's doing this work that is so essential to everything else functioning. And our work touches what Gar and Neva have talked about, in that we're trying to reimagine an economy that fundamentally revalues care, that fundamentally accounts for the need to recognize and support the work that goes into raising families. Work that has historically been associated with women, but is clear that it is fundamental to everything else in the economy functioning. So reimagining an economy and a framework, a social contract, if you will, for the 21st century that invests in a care infrastructure that both makes this work sustainable for the workforce and makes care accessible and affordable to everyone who has families, which is all of us.
You, as I said, are kind of at the nexus between people making real change on the ground today and this big aspirational goal of creating a care-based economy. You write about it in your last book, and we talked about it on the show. Where do you see actual progress towards this goal or these goals taking place, and how are you accomplishing the victories that you're winning?
Well, the National Domestic Workers Alliance was founded in 2007, so next year will be our 10th anniversary. And when we were founded, it was a group of 50 workers and organizers from 6 cities around the country, basically sharing strategies, learning from each other, talking about what it will take to really organize and build the visibility and the value of this work and this workforce. And now, 10 years later, we are 55 affiliate organizations in 38 cities around the country. And we had our first big policy breakthrough in 2010 in New York, when New York became the first state to pass a domestic worker bill of rights. Illinois just became the 7th state to pass a domestic worker bill of rights a week ago. And so we're making progress at the state level, which is really about establishing minimum standards and basic recognition for this workforce. And what we really need to do, and I think what this call is about, is envision, actually, instead of just the minimum standards and protections and thinking about what it would look like to protect this workforce in an old economy framework, how do we imagine a new economy with this workforce at the center? And so some of the policy ideas we have that, and places where we're actually working to make progress, are places like Oregon, where there's an initiative to raise revenue in the state to fundamentally refund a care economy in the state, both child care and elder care. Or in Hawaii, where we've introduced the first ever universal long-term care social insurance fund at the state level, which has no income requirement. Basically, anyone in the state who has a long-term care need would be eligible for up to 365 days of long-term care support. So it's really expanding the way in which we imagine what's politically possible in this arena of investing in the care economy step by step, so that we can eventually get to a place where we have universal access to the care we need.
And what are your greatest challenges at this point?
Well, I think that this issue is one that everyone is touched by, and yet it still has not achieved a level of public awareness, consciousness, and saliency as a priority policy issue. So on the one hand, hundreds of millions of us are affected by the need for more care support, but we rarely bring it into the public policy arena as a top policy priority or an issue that elections get defined on. And I think that's what we have to do, is really elevate this question of how we're going to both work and care for our families in the 21st century as an issue that everyone running for office has to really engage.
The next speaker, I think. Thank you so much, IGen. There's more information about the work of the National Domestic Workers Alliance going to be distributed after this call. I'm going to bring on Riane Eisler now. Riane has thought decades on these topics, and has addressed and does address in her work both the conceptual with her research papers and studies, and also the very practical with a useful series of questions for candidates that she recently released. Could you start, Riane, there's so many places you could begin, but could you start with this sort of macro change picture in order to make the kind of changes that both Neva and IGen are talking about? It seems as if we are going to need exactly the kind of shift to a partnership model that you describe in your reports. Can you talk about that?
Well, thank you very much, Laura. I would like to do what you want, but I want to first start by putting these wonderful presentations in the larger whole systems change context of both what I've identified as a partnership system and a major component of it, which is a new way of structuring economics that goes beyond both capitalism and socialism. What in my book, The Real Wealth of Nations, I call a caring economics, which is really essential today, not only as we've been talking for human and environmental reasons, but for financial reasons. Now, if you really think about it, both capitalism and socialism came out of very early industrial times. And we're now way into the post-industrial technological age. So on that count alone, they would both really be antiquated. But the problem is much more fundamental, because neither capitalism nor socialism recognize the economic value of the work of caring for people, starting in early childhood, and caring for nature. For both Marx and Smith, nature was just there to be exploited. As for the work of caring for people in families, for them, that was not productive work. It was just reproductive work. And we've inherited this flawed system of valuations culturally, and it's even taught in our economic schools. So what we have basically is a system that still carries this heritage, this legacy from times when anything considered women's work was so devalued as to be almost invisible. Now, of course, this has led to enormous suffering, and it has including seemingly intractable cycles of poverty, because, and this is really something that we have to pay attention to, the mass of the world's poor and the poorest of the poor worldwide are those who do the bulk of care work, women. Now, consider that in the United States, according to U.S. Census Bureau figures, women over the age of 65 are twice as likely to live in poverty as men of the same age. And a major reason is that most of them either are or were full or part-time caregivers working for free in households and for poverty level wages in jobs. Now, obviously, this gendered system of values has been a disaster for the female half of humanity, but it's also a major obstacle to what so many of us are working for today, which is a more really equitable, sustainable, and yes, prosperous economy. Consider Nordic nations like Sweden, Finland, Norway, that at the beginning of the 20th century were so poor that they had famines. Today they have very low levels of poverty and a high, good standard of living for all. Now, a major factor is that these nations pioneered caring policies. Policies such as universal health care, such as very generous paid parental leave, nationally funded stipends for families to help care for children, for the sick, for the elderly, and not coincidentally, and this is something we have to start paying attention to, in these nations, having a female head of state is not abnormal. It's really considered normal. And women are 50% of the national legislature, which takes me to a systems dynamic we really have to pay attention to, which is that it's not just that women voted for these caring policies, men did too, because as the status of women rises, both men and women, the entire culture, because economics doesn't arise in a vacuum, it arises in a cultural context, they give more value to care work, so that yes, in these nations, more support for good care starting in childhood which today we know from neuroscience is key to both human capacity development and well-being. So as we shift into the post-industrial economy, when so many jobs are really disappearing, I mean, they're being replaced by automation, by robotics, artificial intelligence is coming down the way. We not only have a crisis, which is why we hear so much about this guaranteed income, and I really love Neva's idea of linking it with a way of elevating the value, of showing the value of care work. But we also have an opportunity, which is the opportunity to redefine what is productive work. And the Center for Partnership Studies Caring Economy campaign provides tools for this, making both a social justice and environmental sustainability case as well as an economic case for supporting care work. And a centerpiece of this campaign are new metrics, because you know, if we don't measure it, if it isn't visible, it's not going to be counted. So we have developed social wealth economic indicators, unique metrics that actually show the enormous economic value of investing in caring for people and nature. And I invite you to go to caringeconomy.org to use and disseminate them, to download our fact sheets, to join our webinars, our leadership training webinars. And also, and you mentioned this, and I think it's so important, we've developed questions for candidates to bring these vital issues, still marginalized, into the political conversation as we approach the November election. And the time is now. So I invite you to really get these resources from caringeconomy.org.
I think that would be fascinating. Give us an example of some of the questions that could help to bring this very critical conversation to the electoral arena in which we find ourselves right now.
Well, the first thing is the value of childcare. I mean, consider that we are the social wealth economic indicators show that we invest less than half of what other developed nations do in family support, including available high quality early child care and education. So the benefits of that, of course, are enormous, if only in economic terms, because for this post-industrial knowledge service economy, we urgently need what economists like to call high-quality human capital. And we know, as I said, from neuroscience, that, well, it largely hinges on the quality of care and education children receive early on. So this is, I mean, as I said, we make both a social justice and an economic case, as we have to. Of course, another area is the Family and Medical Insurance Leave Act, providing for paid family and medical leave. We're the only developed nation that doesn't have nationally paid parental and sick leave. Also, of course, the Paycheck Fairness Act. I mean, as you know, as Aijen pointed out, it isn't only that this work is invisible and devalued in homes, it's paid poverty wages today still in the workplace, and we need really to invest in excellent care workers. I mean, these are our people, our real wealth that we're talking about. And of course, we also absolutely have to do something about collecting data, as we do with the social wealth economic indicators, that really track public and private investments in care and their impact not only on quality of life, but also on economic success. And here I want to tell you something fascinating. You know, we did a study back in 1995 2005, way back at Pioneer, because we're always pioneering things at the Center for Partnership Studies, a study that looked at both general quality of life and at the status of women. And we found that the status of women is a powerful predictor of general quality of life and economic success. And this has now been verified by nothing less than the global gender gap reports of the World Economic Forum, showing that the nations like the ones I mentioned, Sweden, Finland, Norway, that yes, have the lowest gender gap, because unfortunately there's no nation yet that doesn't have a gender gap, also rank very high in global competitiveness. So this is a whole area. And you asked me at the beginning to talk about the partnership and domination systems, and of course that would take another webinar. But what I want to say about it is that one of the problems that we have is that we're stuck in these old categories, not only capitalism versus socialism, when both are really faulty. Yes, we need a free market. We don't happen to have one. And we also need government planning, but we have to go beyond that to a whole different system of values. And or right versus left, we've had terrible regimes on both the right and left, for goodness sakes, or Eastern and Western, the same. I've introduced a whole new frame of what I've called the partnership configuration and the domination configuration. And yes, one of the central pieces is not only the ranking of, the domination system, ranking man over man and man over nature, it's race over race, etc., but ranking man over woman. And with it, the devaluation of those human qualities and capacities, such as caring, caregiving, nonviolence. If we don't address that issue as part of what is, quote, politically and socially important, we are missing the boat completely. And this is not a, quote, women's issue. This is a basic human, political, and economic issue. So the difference between the partnership and domination systems and these other categories, in those categories, we pay attention to the foundational human relations, which children really internalize even before their brains are developed. Childhood experiences and relations and gender relations.
Can I ask you just quickly before we move on, Riane, to add your perspective on racial domination to that picture?
Well, it's not coincidental, if you really think about it, that way back when the authoritarian personality studies were done after World War II, when a group of scholars got together to try to figure out how could this happen, how could the Holocaust happen, how could the Nazis rise to power, it's not coincidental that people who grow up in families that are what I call domination families, okay, rigidly male-dominated, top-down, authoritarian, punitive families, they tend to vote, as we're seeing today with Trump, aren't we, for people who like their authority figures in childhood. They can be mean. They even love these mean figures, right? So we're really talking about systems dynamics that we have to start paying attention to. And we've ignored them, and they're still being ignored. And it's ironic, I tell you this, Laura. People who are trying to push us back, whether it's ISIS or whether it's the so-called rightist fundamentalist alliance in the United States, they recognize the importance of gender and childhood. I mean, they're always talking, aren't they, about going back to a, quote, traditional family, getting women back into their, quote, traditional subservient place, punitive family. But the progressives, we are still thinking of these as just women's and children's issues. And my work has been to change this.
You've got some partners there, I know, on this call, and many listening in. We're going to get to some questions from the webinar in just a second, but I would love to give Gar a chance to come back and pick up on one of the themes that has been commented on, and that's that question of getting out of the binary, capitalist versus socialist, right versus left. Would you like to add anything to that discussion? Because I know that's something that you've thought about a lot.
Well, yes, indeed. Most of the work I've done, and indeed the next system project is how do we get beyond these categories? How do we get beyond capitalism? How do we get beyond the traditional socialism? And one of the formulations which intersects with the discussion we've had so far, as I've tried to say all too briefly, is how do we build community? And it's another way of saying altering the relationships between genders, ages, between the whole community as a whole. And how do we do that not only culturally? And here I have a slightly different perspective. I've just come back from Scandinavia, where the welfare state is beginning to be frayed at the edges because the economics aren't working. So I think we also need to pay attention, and this is, I hope, how we will begin to formulate the discussion in the coming period, between how do we begin to build an economic system that allows for and nurtures the kinds of relationships we're talking about. At the current moment, we're finding we can't get money's being cut back, not added, for the sorts of things that we all support. And that's part of the political economy of the whole system. So that becomes a central issue which I think we have to bring into the discussion. If we avoid it and keep it at the level only of the cultural matters and the relationships matters, I suspect we'll not be able to deal with the power relationships that have been fraying exactly what everyone here is talking about. So I want to ask the people, how do we begin to bring those two pieces back together? And a further piece on that, and partly out of my own, I come from Wisconsin and worked with the most progressive parts of the House and Senate directing legislation. There was a moment when we could pass traditional legislation of the kind we're talking about, and improved legislation, but it depended upon strong labor unions to do that. So I think the power base for the traditional Scandinavian model isn't available. So we are really in a bind of how we not only deal with the cultural issues, the gender issues, and the technological issues, but not avoid the question of power and its relationship to how we build and rebuild the economic system. So I want to bring that back into the discussion and urge that this valuable and critical discussion be brought to a level that where both parts of the problem can be addressed directly and back and forth between the two. I think the community is the place to start, but it's certainly not the place to end.
May I say something?
Can I bring Ijen back in on exactly that? Ijen, can I get you to address some of those points, Ijen? Are you there?
Yep, I'm here, and I absolutely, I really agree that there's a fundamental question of power here. And one of the things that we have to start shifting is the way that we think about power, the way that we build it, and who has it, and how do we support communities who have been the least visible in our current system of domination or inequality, however you want to describe it, to actually have a voice and a really critical central role in shaping the next systems. And that's a lot of what our work is about, elevating the leadership and the voices and the experiences of women of color, particularly Black women, undocumented immigrant women, rural white working class women, women who have been on the front lines of the most brutal dimensions of our current economy, to be able to imagine and dream about a future where they would have the kind of support to and nurturing of relationships that they actually are naturally predisposed towards and have been investing in against all odds in very organic ways. So I really want us to see communities that have been under-resourced as a resource and a base and a source of power, and really want to turn the question towards how do we invest in those communities to actually help lead in the creation and realization of some of these solutions.
Andrew Becker on the webinar right now had a question for you, Ijen. He asked what you meant when you said that, or rather he asked when you said that domestic workers should be at the center of the economy, what workforce, he asks, would you say is at the center of the economy today?
Well, I don't actually know that Well, I do know that some of the fastest growing sectors are in healthcare and certainly in the service industry. I would say that the driving forces are really kind of low-wage service work that is kind of become the base of our economy. And a lot of people would argue that increasing amounts of our economy are contingent, subcontracted, temporary, self-employed types of work, so more and more informal work. But I would say when you think about who's at the center of the conversation, it's certainly, you hear a lot about tech, you hear a lot about kind of elite service workers, the more creative professions, and I would love to see more attention paid to the realities of low-wage workers across these different service sectors, which are increasingly unregulated and excluded from dimensions of our safety net that we've taken for granted for a very long time. So that's what I meant, is perhaps maybe it's less about putting certain groups of workers in the center, but actually looking at who's really driving the economy and making sure that those workers are have a voice and also have the kinds of protections and ability to organize and realize a living wage with benefits as possible.
We should, this is an opportunity for me to mention that we have an interview coming up, I think it's literally on next week's program, with Palak Shah, who works closely with you around the question of those tech workers that you mentioned. They may be central in the rhetoric, but the challenges that they face when it comes to work to rights in the workplace and the relationship with employment and employers are very strained and challenged. And there is a project that you are a part of to put forward a Bill of Rights for those workers too, and I encourage people to check out the Laura Flanders show. It's either next week or the week after. I'm talking with Palak, who puts it out very beautifully. A couple more questions, and some of these are for Neva. Neva, one of them comes from Jay Nelson participating in the webinar. Jay asks about the relationship between work in the community and work in the home under your system. Under the system of core support, I think the question is, would people still have the incentive to work outside the home, in the community?
That's probably my old friend Julie Nelson writing in on that question. And she has written really good things about how much work is needed and the balance between consumption and work. So it all depends really on technology and also resources, because in one possible future there is much less work needed to actually be done. Now, already in our economy, there's a lot of work being done that isn't needed. There are a lot of people producing things that nobody really wants, at least that don't make people happy when they get them. But they're induced to buy a lot of things that aren't going to necessarily make them happy, because our economy runs on a system of producing ever more and getting people to buy what's produced. It's already a problem there that we have excess capacity is the term that's used, and if we were to stop producing things that were not needed or that did not give additions to well-being, we would have an enormous amount of excess human capacity, and therefore could afford to have far fewer labor hours contributed by people working. Now, I think Julie's question was, yes, but would even people work enough to fill the real needs? And we don't really know the answer to that. It hasn't been tried on a very large scale, although there have been some experiments in Canada, in Africa, where people certainly didn't totally stop working in the formal workforce. They showed an interest in maintaining those relationships. So I'm optimistic that that could happen, and probably would happen, that enough work would get done. On the other possibility is that technology won't continue in the direction it has been going. particularly that resource scarcities will make it impossible to continue to develop technology that can use machines rather than humans. In that case, the need for human labor wouldn't drop nearly as much. Again, here we come back to culture and to values. If we only produced the things that were really going to contribute to well-being, we still would need a lot less work than is done today.
More questions are coming into the webinar. I encourage you to pose your questions if you're participating in the call. There's also an interesting conversation happening about this webinar on Twitter. You can follow the hashtag #TowardCare. That's hashtag #TowardCare. And I will just remind everyone that at the end of this webinar, if you've registered, we will be able to send you links to the materials of all of our speakers, and you'll get a sense of their work more in depth. A couple of questions. One for you, Riane, around political capital. One person wants to know what current political capital exists to see the caring economy come to fruition in the United States. I fear many of us have a negative answer to that, but maybe you have more optimism or enthusiasm or insight. And then again, this question of systemic and institutional, especially anti-black racism is coming up, and people want that addressed. How does that fit in to the caring economy? And I'd love whoever wants to address that to address that. But let's start with you, Riane, and then perhaps Gar, if you could come in on these questions. Riane.
Well, I'd like to start with something that Gar said, two things. One, Scandinavian countries, and two, the issue of structure, because they're both vital. On the first one, very briefly, I mean, the reason that the Scandinavian countries are retrenching somewhat is that we have a globalization that is not structured to really support the work of care. And it is the globalization that's globalization per se is neutral, but a globalization that is structured to not support care work is causing the problem. But the second thing is this. When we talk about culture and structure, they're completely interconnected. I will give you an example. We hear a lot about neoliberalism today being structurally faulty. But neoliberalism is nothing more than domination economics. Trickle-down economics isn't a matter of capitalism. It's a matter of domination economics that goes back, way back, to when people used to be socialized to content themselves with the scraps falling from the opulent tables of their feudal overlords. And it's not Western. You know, China, the empires, etc. So I don't think that we can make the distinction, Gar, between structure and culture. They're too intertwined. We structure things following what we value. And if we devalue care work, if we devalue the work of the most fundamental work of caring for people and for nature, then we're going to have structures that perpetuate that. The partnership system is about different structures. And these structures in turn support relationships of mutuality rather than these top-down rankings. But, you know, in terms of race,
I mean, in a sense, just to interject there, in a sense what you're saying is that there has been a top-down ranking where culture hasn't occupied the place it needed to, in a sense.
Well, I'm afraid that the culture has been informed by a faulty system of values in which anything considered soft, feminine, like caring, caregiving, along with women, has been devalued. So then you build structures that perpetuate this. I mean, in The Real Wealth of Nations, I make the point again and again that if we don't change our structures to be informed by caring for, I mean, we need hierarchies of actualization. We can't just have completely flat organizations. And that's another subject, of course. But I want to talk about race because the correlation between prejudice and growing up in families which are domination families, where women are devalued, where basically it's authoritarian. It's been established again and again, not only by my work, but by countless other psychologists and sociologists. So again, we have to look at connecting the dots in a different way. And this is what I really want to talk about.
Couple of questions. Gar, will you pick up on some of those? One, the question of cultural, political capital.
Yes, thanks very much. I think the difficulty I'm having with the way the conversation is moving is that I certainly agree with almost every part of the value and cultural argument that's being made by Riane and others. And that the issue, and that indeed the feminists have made throughout the country and in many, many other countries that are beginning to raise the value question powerfully. What hasn't been talked about enough, although we had just a bit of it a moment ago about power, is the dynamics that are undercutting the new values. I come from my perspective starts with Martin Buber's theory of community, which is a relational theory that I'm sure Riane and others know begins I-thou rather than top-down. And the question is, how do we build economic structure that can sustain and nurture different relationships? And I don't think that's a simple question. I don't think we can just say it would be important to do this. I like very much the notion of building the kind of organizing that labor organizing and the sort of things that we're seeing developed in Oregon particularly that were mentioned. That's a power question that's being addressed along with the cultural question. The institutions of community that are economic institutions that I mentioned are another way of getting at power and institutions that actually nurture these values. And I think the third thing I want to say is that the traditional way this was done, and certainly it was done in Scandinavia, was to build a powerful labor union base to bring in and control and limit the excesses of capitalism. But the labor union base in almost all the advanced countries has been undercut and lost power in virtually all the countries, with the capacity to move resources reduced. So that our power structure and the whole way in which we've organized is at a kind of a dead end, which is why I want to offer again the notion that unless we bring together the caring discussion and the issues raised by important feminists and people thinking about cultural change with how do we change the economic power base from the bottom up of the system, I don't think we get where we want to go. And I think there is a chasm. And I think policy is one level, but the question of structure and restructuring power and ownership in a system where ownership dominates a good part of the political system, I think has to be brought into this conversation. And I would urge that we begin to do that in a much more sustained and organized and integrated way. We are, finally, the last thing to say about it, what we're talking about in most of the advanced systems now are capitalist systems. There are no state socialist systems. So the question we're facing here, there are many parts of the other parts of the world that it's not true, is how do we alter and transcend this capitalism to a new form that goes beyond both state socialism and also corporate capitalism. That, I think that dynamic has to be brought back, or the conversation splits out into ways that divide the political as well as the cultural debate.
And your assessment of where the political capital is for that right now?
Well, I think what's interesting about the word right now is a good one, Laura, but what's interesting is we are beginning to see loss of faith, and I think that's why this is an extremely important period historically. We're seeing loss of faith in the traditional strategies, disillusionment with them, and at the same time anger growing, and potentially mobilizing political power. And at the same time questioning corporate capitalism, questioning state socialism, raising deep issues of culture and values. I see this as the potentially, if we work together rather than divide the conversation, potentially the prehistory, let me use that word carefully, the prehistory of developing a whole theory of the next system and its cultural as well as political power dimensions, and laying that out and beginning community by community, area by area, to build the mosaic of a new power system that looks towards something beyond both. And I think at the center of that is, I'm happy to use the word relational or caring. The term I use coming out of Martin Buber would be a system built on the theory and meaning and power of community, which invests in and values all parts of the community, gender as well as age, as well as the time scale of different points in time in life cycle. All of that speaks to the term community, or another way to talk about it is caring. But the issue, I think, cannot avoid who owns the economic power of the system. If we avoid that question, I think we lose on all fronts.
A couple of potential ways to go. I would just love to include Robert Loeb's question in the conversation right now, but I don't want to move us too far from this question of power and politics, because I think at a certain point before the end of the call, it would be great to get our commentators to reflect on this moment in the way that you have, meaning really this moment, and what could come out of this kind of extraordinary electoral year that we've been through. But the question coming from Robert Loeb is very practical, and I think it's one, in a sense, for Neva. If the idea of financing a core support system depends on the continued shrinking of the traditional commercial economy, traditional commercial activity, and means, therefore, more and more resources going to fewer and fewer people, is the idea that taxation on the wealthy will increase somehow? And if that's the case, is the idea that government will tax wealth at a higher rate to pay for this core support? But you know, is that a realistic? I think that the end of the question is kind of, is that a realistic assumption? Neva.
Okay, so I've looked at a lot of literature on basic income guarantees, and they do often rely very heavily on two things. One is taxation, and the other is moving resources from existing social networks, some of which can be done safely and some of which I think cannot. I don't think there's any basic income guarantee that will necessarily take care of all needs. And so I worry about trying to move too much from existing social networks. Taxation, yes, if you have fewer people, okay, again, you've got to distinguish between income and wealth. And Gar's point about needing to change the power from those who have a huge amount of wealth and really determine what happens in our society, that is critical. And so the first part of the answer to this good question is a lot of that has to be taxed away, but that's not going to do the whole thing. And so there have been a number of other interesting suggestions about other ways that this income could be generated. Monetary policy. Instead of printing money for direct bank funding, print money to give directly to citizens. Then also collective resource ownership and commonwealth dividends, so that profits generated by publicly owned enterprises, programs that distribute wealth deriving from commons, such as natural resources, rents from extractive industries, so that we take back the sources of wealth that have been expropriated from all of us. There's been a suggestion for universal stock ownership. I actually don't think that's a good way to go. And a giant indexed mutual fund that pays equal dividends to everyone, like the Alaska Permanent Fund. That's been proposed in a book called A Shared Market Economy, where the author claims that the Fed could capitalize this fund without raising taxes. I do think raising taxes on both wealth and very high incomes is going to have to be a big piece of it, but can't be the whole thing.
Thank you. Aijen, do you want to come back in on this question of the sort of political realities in which we find ourselves, and how do we move this conversation forward?
Well, I do want to say that I think that this moment of change is a huge opportunity, and that it is up to us to really think about how we broaden the constituency for this set of values and this vision. And with the older population growing and the millennial generation starting to turn 35 and having children, the numbers of people who are directly affected by the need for care, the need for more support, and infrastructure in the core economy, the more people understand the fundamental nature of partnership and relationships, I think there is a huge way in which this moment of change in our social relations, in our economy, and in our demographics is an opportunity to build real political power around these ideas. And I want to challenge us to really do so, to be creative in how we do that.
Do you think realistically, without getting partisan about this, that there could be a future of this kind of conversation for the many millions, 7 and more millions, who have expressed a desire for an alternative economy through participating in the Bernie Sanders campaign?
Absolutely. I think that we have a lot of work to do to reaffirm. I think what the Bernie Sanders campaign did was really engage and energize a set of people who might be disillusioned by our elections process and our democracy, and rightly so. And I think we have to keep promoting ways in which it is incredibly important for people to engage in this democratic system and process, even as we seek to transform it. And having a very bold and compelling economic vision can be one of those things that motivates and energizes people. So I want to challenge us to speak directly to voters, particularly voters who are directly affected by our failure to have a next system vision, and who are disenfranchised in a number of ways, both from our democracy and from our economic opportunity.
Thank you. We're coming towards the last part of our conversation, and I would love to get some kind of brass tacks into this discussion, and maybe Gar, come to you, and then Riane on some of these. But you know, we on our program at the Laura Flanders Show are interviewing people on a weekly basis who are grappling with these issues, whether they're academics like Zila Eisenstein, who we had on recently talking about feminism and Marxism and capitalism, or activists like the extraordinary young people of color, women of color-led folks who are campaigning against police brutality, or creating sustainable farms feeding communities in upstate New York. If you're interested in more on that, you can check out our report on Soulfire Farm. Whether it's Filipino workers who were trafficked here, who were creating co-ops to regain some power in the workplace. This conversation is happening in all these different communities. It never feels like the same conversation in terms of, you know, the way it's presented, even in conversations, even in locations like this. And yet, I believe, as you do, that there are strains that connect all of this. And I think that's very much what you're trying to do with the Next System project, and one of the reasons that we're so committed to it. Could you talk a little bit about what's working and perhaps what isn't working when it comes to bringing a big tent together around this question of really macro shift to a more caring, human-centered, planetary sound way of organizing ourselves? Gar.
Well, I totally agree with that. I think it's an extraordinary moment, and what Ajin said about the capturing the possibilities, that everyone was surprised at the vast number of people who in the United States of America called themselves socialists. Whatever that might mean, it meant that people wanted something bigger and change. I think that's right, but still not a majority, and a great deal of work to do. So what we're seeing in the Next System project is not only the development of a debate about values, a debate about priorities, and a debate of the kind we're seeing here today, and it coming most powerfully out of feminism, which has contributed the essence of this. But we're seeing it also in the black community. We're building community structures, not only political power, not only dealing with the police, but changing economic power, and often always collectively in some way, cooperatives, community-based, land trusts, neighborhood organization. Not personal, but building out power in a different form. And we're seeing that also, I think, in other parts of the ecological movement, where the question is, how do you structure economic institutions, starting at the bottom and building up an entirely different mosaic and possibility of vision that might ultimately be transcendent? It has not yet come together with a real politics. I think we're in the prehistory of that. But in one sense, it is an extraordinarily fertile time because none of the existing alternatives is providing answers for the kinds of problems we're talking about. And most importantly, and I think critically, since I was very closely involved with the labor movement in the United States has gone from 35% of the labor force down to 6%. It was the power base of the traditional welfare system that attempted to deal with corporate capitalism. It is gone. So either we build a new power base, labor unions wherever possible, but community structures, community organizing, groups of different parts that are of the economy, different groups, the elderly, feminist groups, but also structures of ownership that begin dealing with how we control these new technologies. And I think all of that is beginning to have some form of communitarian vision in it, either communities or workers, a model well beyond either traditional capitalism or traditional socialism. In the form of the notion that it is a prehistory, that we need to build up now step by step to a new vision, I think is the heart of the matter. It's the part that people have to struggle with, because in all cases we have not had the capacity to alter trends. The trends in most cases have been going south on economic, on social and ecological matters. We need to build the power that can achieve the values and alter the structures, mostly corporate capitalism in the modern era, with state socialism in a different era as well, that build a different system beyond. So it is a systemic problem, but it begins ultimately, essentially, with values and mobilizing from a cultural value base.
Riane, can you talk a little bit about where you're seeing success in discussing this transition, or even simply discussing the kind of relational dynamics that you write about? Is there anywhere in the media these conversations are happening? You need to unmute yourself.
There.
Now you're unmuted.
I see
First,
success.
step one, unmute yourself. Right.
I see success.
You're good.
I see success in many ways. When we launched our Caring Economy campaign in 2009, the whole issue of the value of the work of care was hardly spoken about. The media were completely silent about it. And it's beginning to enter the conversation. But as Gar says, it isn't enough to change the conversation. It is also having people become motivated by different thinking to take different action. I wrote a book called The Power of Partnership, which basically makes the point that to try to move, to accelerate this movement from a domination system to a partnership system requires both changed awareness, which then leads to action, and as we change the structure and the values, we then again have more awareness of what is possible. I think we have to have a positive alternative out there, not just criticize. And the alternative of an economic system that takes into account, first of all, not just what happens in the market, but also what happens outside the market. Household work, volunteer work is a first step. A second step is new economic indicators. The social wealth economic indicators provide the metrics, the measurements, but they not only show where we are in terms of quality of life and human capacity development, they also show the correlation between the kinds of investments that a nation makes and what the quality of life and economic competitiveness looks like. These are tools that I think we can all use. And I think that the mobilizing today cannot just depend on labor unions. We have got to mobilize parents. We've got to mobilize the elderly. We've got to mobilize, as IGEN is doing, not only the domestic workers, but the restaurant workers. It's beginning to happen, but it hasn't coalesced because there hasn't been an understanding of what's missing, which is the core value of care work, be it performed outside the market or in the market, and how to structure our economic system to reward that work properly.
Thank you. Ijen, what an invitation to you. If you could describe a little bit of how you are doing that organizing. I know through covering it, something about caring across generations, something about the domestic workers and the restaurant workers, but you are really modeling, you and your colleagues, a different kind of labor organizing, really organizing the entire community.
We are trying to organize everyone who has a stake in a strong care economy. In terms of the workers, we have affiliate organizations who are working in local communities, oftentimes ethnic community-specific organizations who are building committees of domestic workers, who are organizing, offering workforce training, offering Know Your Rights education, leadership development, all kinds of ways that we're building power locally and feeding into statewide campaigns for domestic workers' protections at the state level. We also were a part of organizing to bring the 2 million home care workers who were excluded from minimum wage and overtime protections under those protections, and the regulatory change that made that happen went into effect in October. So we're organizing home care workers in states, particularly in the South, where the workforce, the wages have been particularly low and the workers have been particularly vulnerable. So we're organizing direct care workers throughout the South and the Southwest, implementing the new rule change. And through caring across generations, we're building with local communities around the country who want to build care councils that are bringing older adults who want to stay in their homes and communities, people with disabilities who want to live independently, family caregivers who are struggling to balance work and care for their loved ones and the workforce together to say, hey, we are one team in a partnership model, absolutely, and that we need each other. And through building our sense of interdependence and mutual support, we can actually build an incredibly powerful force for political change as well. And looking at introducing very bold legislation in 5 to 7 states that includes a major investment in our care systems. It'll not only improve quality of jobs for workers, but also affordability of care for working class families, which is a huge, huge issue. So I encourage everyone to get involved in Caring Across Generations at caringacross.org. We have national organizing calls every month that you can hop on and get plugged in. And if you know anybody who works as a care worker or a domestic worker of any sort, have them sign up right away at domesticworkers.org. And we're launching our member benefits program in July so they can get access to benefits and services as well as get involved in the movement starting in July.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And just a reminder to people, the voice you were just hearing, if you're just listening, is that of Jim Poo. She's the director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance and the co-director of the Caring Across Generations campaign. We've also been joined by Riane Eisler, who is the president of the Center for Partnership Studies and director of the Caring Economy campaign. You can go there to get the questions for candidates, also her work on alternative economic indicators. Neva Goodwin is the co-director of the Global Development and Environment Institute at Tufts, and she will be, her material on the core support program will be available also to webinar registrants. I want to give Gar the last word to just encourage, just to give us an idea of where this work goes next. Got about a minute, Gar.
All I want to say is that the conversation has been extraordinary, and beginning, it's one of the first conversations beginning to address, from my point of view, the caring structure, the issues of values, and then the system dynamics question. And we're beginning to see at the core of that is power, and then the next step is institutions. No one has an answer to how we restructure the next system, how we move beyond capitalism and socialism, and how the power base to make the values real, how that can be built, what it looks like, and how to build the power to get there and the culture. I think this kind of a conversation is extraordinary in opening this dialogue between the different parts of the discussion, bringing it back to power, bringing it more to institutions and their dynamics. That's the name of the game for the next step as we move this right in the heart of politics and cultural change. And I think more and more of this, all the people on the panel have different ways of entering it, but from my point of view, extraordinary contributions. And thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Laura.
you very much. I would simply conclude by thanking you for inviting me to be part of this and reminding everybody that in our discussion of dominant systems as opposed to partnership and relational systems, money-driven media is central, and it's not where we're going to find these conversations with a different set of values happening. So one of the institutions that we need to build is our alternative media institutions, and we're doing it here a little bit at a time together, and I thank you for letting me be part of it. It's a pleasure. Encourage everyone on the panelist side to stay on this line for a moment, but I believe our webinar needs to end, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Join the Next System project. Thank you.